What evidence is there that the team of volunteer rescuers known as the White Helmets are actually a propaganda construct designed to enable regime change in Syria? What is motivating the entity Avaaz and its PR firm Purpose to promote both regime change narratives and aggressive action on climate change? What evidence is there that the White Helmets are aligned with terrorist groups and taking part in organ harvesting and other crimes? Could suspicions around the beneficiaries of international funding of the White Helmets be linked to the recent death of the group's founder, James Mesurier? Why are some on-the-ground journalists in Syria being targeted by a sophisticated media smear campaign? On this week's Global Research News Hour, we pierce the impressive propaganda fog around the White Helmets group and policy around Syria generally, and try to get a grasp on the powerful figures that are shaping media and NGO discourse around military interventions and the green agenda. Our guests for the hour are independent journalists Cory Morningstar and Vanessa Beeley. On this week's program, White Helmets, James Mesurier, and the Humanitarian Regime Change Network. Conversations with Cory Morningstar and Vanessa Beeley. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of December 13th, 2019. I'm series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Center for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg, on occupied Anishinaabe-Gaking, the homeland of the Métis Nation and the historical territory of the Nahiwak and the Nakota. We seek to provide you with access to analysis of the major issues shaping our world today from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available from the Center's website, globalresearch.ca. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. Before taking up the task of training Syrian volunteers for search and rescue operations in 2013, Mesurier was a British Army veteran and a private security contractor from 2008 to 2012, working for Good Harbor, run by Richard Clarke, the former Bush administration counterterrorism czar. Much like Eric Prince of the Blackwater fame, Mesurier's work included training several thousand mercenaries for the United Arab Emirates Oil and Gas Field Protection Force, and designing security infrastructure for the police state of Abu Dhabi, a job description that helped him recruit Syrian volunteers from refugee camps in Turkey willing to do dirty humanitarian work in enclaves carved out by militant factions in Syria's war zones. In this line of work, one is likely to make powerful enemies, including intelligence agencies and militant groups. He could have been killed by any one of them. In particular, the White Helmets operate in al-Nusra Front's territory in Syria's northwestern Idlib province and are known to take orders from the terrorist outfit. That comes from the article, White Helmets founder was allegedly assassinated. Turkish report by Nauman Sadiq, posted December 11th. When our own government no longer sees us as human beings with dignity and worth, but as things to be manipulated, maneuvered, mined for data, manhandled by police, conned into believing it has our best interests at heart, mistreated, and then jails us if we dare step out of line, punishes us unjustly without remorse, and refuses to own up to its failings, we are no longer operating under a constitutional republic. Instead, what we are experiencing is a pathocracy, tyranny at the hands of a psychopathic government which operates against the interests of its own people except for favoring certain groups. So where does that leave us? Having allowed the government to expand and exceed our reach, we find ourselves on the losing end of a tug-of-war over control of our country and our lives. And for as long as we let them, government officials will continue to trample on our rights, always justifying their actions as being for the good of the people. That comes from the article, Sin Taxes and Orwellian Methods of Compliance That Feed the Government's Greed, by John W. Whitehead, posted December 11th, originally published on the Rutherford Institute. China has invested heavily in railways in remote areas like the Three Gorges, Qinghai, Xinjiang, and Tibet. in an attempt to connect the length and breadth of the country with convenient and fast transportation. Chinese leaders recognized from the beginning that economic development follows transportation, and thus maintaining control of the transportation infrastructure derives from a determination to distribute the benefits of development to the entire nation. The reality is that not all infrastructure is destined to be financially profitable, profitability being the only measure by Western standards. A privately developed railway system would be built only on the most profitable routes, those likely to amass billions for their owners, but that would leave perhaps half the nation destitute for transportation and sentenced to perpetual poverty. Thus, railway privatization would saddle China's central government with the costs of building all the unprofitable routes without benefiting from the profitable segments. That comes from the article, From Shanghai to Chongqing, the World's Most Expensive Railway, by Larry Romanoff, posted December 11th. Unlike the USSR, which kept oppression confined within its borders and those of neighboring countries under its sphere of influence, Britain, together with the American Empire, to which it handed over the baton of imperialism after WW II, has interfered on pretty much every continent except Antarctica. In modern times, we see the UK, now a vassal of the US-led NATO empire, condemn nations that refuse to submit to Western hegemony. Apologists for empire claim it brought progress such as railways, infrastructure, education, cricket, as well as free trade and order, i.e. Pax Britannica, irrespective of whether such gifts were appreciated by occupied nations. This line of reasoning opens up a dangerous precedent. For example, supporters of Stalin overlook his despotism by crediting him with rapidly industrializing an underdeveloped nation that later played a major role in defeating Nazism, is bestowing upon him an honor that instead belongs to millions of rank-and-file soldiers, officers, and commanders of the Red Army. That comes from the article, Divide and Conquer Tactics, Millions of Deaths Triggered by the British Empire, by Tomasz Pierszonik, posted December 11th, originally published on RT. These are just a few of the featured articles appearing last week on the Global Research website. Regular visitors to the site are encouraged to send monetary contributions by fax, mail, or online. Just go to globalresearch.ca and click Donate on the menu bar. In her emotional testimony to the Congressional Human Rights Caucus on October 10, 1990, a 15-year-old girl who provided only her first name, Nayira, stated that after the Iraqis had invaded Kuwait, she had witnessed Iraqi soldiers take babies out of incubators in a Kuwaiti hospital, take the incubators, and leave the babies to die. Her story was initially corroborated by Amnesty International and testimony from evacuees. The testimony was widely publicized and was cited numerous times by United States senators and President George Herbert Walker Bush in their rationale to back Kuwait in the Gulf War. In 1992, it was revealed by outlets like ABC and the CBC that Nayira's last name was actually al-Sabah, and that she was the daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Furthermore, it was revealed that her testimony was organized as part of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait public relations campaign, which was run by an American public relations firm, Hill and Knowlton, for the Kuwaiti government. Following this, al-Sabah's testimony has come to be regarded as a classical example of modern atrocity propaganda. Listeners, I want you to reflect on that illustration. We're talking about an episode where a war agenda was enabled by a very clever narrative that sparked public outrage and public sympathy and was successful and resulted in a major bloodbath and sanctions that decimated hundreds of thousands of children, and continues to this day to be a major indictment of U.S. and NATO foreign policy. Because on today's show, we're going to be talking about these narratives that are paving the way for war and imperial greed and rapacity. with two individuals who've done their homework on some of these modern narratives and the people behind them. And they're going to be sharing, I mean, I've interviewed them both before on this show. I have one of them, her name is Vanessa Beeley. She's just completed a 7-city tour of Canada, a speaking tour on her research into the Syrian war agenda and Canada's role there. And of course, on the line we have Cory Morningstar, who we've had on the show program before. She's one of the leading writers on what's been called the non-profit industrial complex and how that has had a corrosive impact on the environmental movements and environmental and social consciousness. So before I bring them on, I want to take a couple of minutes more just to introduce them briefly. Vanessa Beeley is an independent journalist and photographer who has worked extensively in the Middle East, on the ground in Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Palestine, while also covering the conflict in Yemen since 2015. In 2017, Vanessa was a finalist for the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, which was won by the much-acclaimed Robert Perry that year. In 2018, Vanessa was named one of the 238 most respected journalists in the United Kingdom by the British National Council for the Training of Journalists. And in 2019, Vanessa was among recipients of the Serena Shim Award for Uncompromising Integrity in Journalism. And she writes regularly to Mint Press News, 21st Century Wire, The Last American, UK Column, and Global Research, among other independent outlets. And joining us by phone, as I mentioned, Cory Morningstar, independent investigative journalist, writer, and environmental activist, focusing on global ecological collapse and political analysis of the non-profit industrial complex. She resides in London, Canada, and her recent writings can be found on Wrong Kind of Green, The Art of Annihilation, and Counterpunch. Her writing has also been published by Bolivia Rising and Cambio, the official newspaper for the plurinational state of Bolivia, or maybe at least, I'm not sure if that's still the case, but at any rate, Vanessa, Cory, welcome to the Global Research News Hour.
Good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Okay, so it's great to have you on. We might start by maybe just chatting a little bit about some of the important recent developments that have surfaced in recent weeks. Now, Vanessa, both of you actually have done research into the White Helmets. Mm-hmm. I know that, Cory, as far as I know, Cory pretty much initiated or was one of the major people in instigating this research, and I know, Vanessa, you picked up that baton pretty adeptly. And,
Cory put me on the road to the White Helmets, let's say, and also educated me extensively on the NPIC and the NGO complex. I mean, I owe a lot of the knowledge that I have now, which is nowhere near as extensive as Cory's, to Cory herself. So big thanks to Cory for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Vanessa's very modest. Her journalism is breathtaking. It's amazing. And actually, when I sort of delved into that, when I came across that, and that's when I actually came into contact with Vanessa. And as you say, Michael, she picked up the baton, and I mean, Vanessa. I quickly observed that Vanessa was just such an amazing, meticulous journalist with such integrity that allowed me to go back and continue to focus on the environmental ecological movement, because Vanessa needs no help whatsoever, really. Just people sharing and reading her work. I mean, she's done such a brilliant job. I can't think of anyone that's done such great work. Syria, the White Helmets, is Vanessa.
Yeah, there's been, of course, the work on the White Helmets has very much made you, Vanessa, a figure of, well, shall we say, controversy, especially within mainstream circles, and the idea that the White Helmets, that there is a factual basis, which you've provided in your your talks and in your writing and articles for the idea that they are aligned with these Nusra elements and the Al-Qaeda factions that have entered into Syria. Of course, we know for people who care to investigate. I mean, we know of that Operation Timber Sycamore, which was responsible, which was disclosed, and even the New York Times has written about this, that they have been funded and armed by the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And this has been an operation going on since 2013, where we see all these elements enter into Syria. And interestingly enough, the White Helmets has been described by numerous writers, not just yourself and another mutual friend, Ava Bartlett, but also the people like Robert Perry, or his Consortium News, Rick Sterling,
John Pilger.
John Pilger, yes, he also advocated for you as well. And of course, there's also that important panel discussion that took place about a year ago at the UN, and you presented there as well as another fellow. Just give us, if you will, maybe a quick elevator speech, just to bring folks up to speed about the case for the idea that this Syrian civil defense, as it's been referred to in some circles, the White Helmets are actually, in fact, a propaganda construct and not actual volunteer helpers.
Well, effectively, the White Helmets are a shadow state construct. Even the fact that they call themselves the Syria Civil Defense, they're not the Syria Civil Defense. There is an existing civil defense organization that was established inside Syria in 1953, and it's the only recognized civil defense organization by the International Civil Defense Organization in Geneva. That's on record. They don't recognize the White Helmets. Why? Because the White Helmets were effectively established, incubated in Turkey and Jordan. They were established by a former British military intelligence officer, James Mesurier, with funding from the majority of the belligerent states that have been waging this regime change war against Syria for 9 years. Primarily the British government and the US government, both of which have funded the White Helmets to the tune of over $35 million. Britain actually around £40 million. And that funding is ongoing. We know that President Trump has just given them a further $4.5 million. And this organization was created, in my opinion, because in 2013 the media was losing its grip on the narrative in Syria. They were being exposed as fabricating narratives in order to demonize and criminalize the Syrian government. We saw, of course, Dani Abdul Dayem being exposed as faking a report from Baba Amra and Homs, and a number of other reports that were extremely questionable. So the media was starting to be seriously exposed, even at UN level. So in my opinion, at this stage, they decided to bring in, not only to increase funding to some of what they call the citizen journalists, the embedded journalists in the areas occupied by the terrorist groups, so affiliated to the terrorist groups, or certainly sympathizing with the terrorist groups, dominated by Nusra Front, by Al-Qaeda. So the White Helmets were created in March 2013. Again, let's look at timing. They were created just as the terrorists were using, or were reported to have used, chemical weapons against civilians and army in Khan al-Assad in March 2013. So the White Helmets were created at exactly this time. 6 months later, of course, we had, as the inspectors arrived to investigate the alleged use of chemical weapons by terrorist groups, which has been denied throughout this conflict, as the inspectors arrived in Damascus in August 2013, lo and behold, a chemical weapon attack took place in eastern Ghouta and the suburbs of Damascus, which many believe was the first of the staged events depicting a chemical attack to criminalize and vilify the Syrian government. So in my opinion, the White Helmets were created for a number of reasons. One, to give a veneer of respectability to the terrorist groups. The fact that the White Helmets are operating alongside them enables the narrative that these terrorists are the moderate rebels that as they have been described by Western media for almost the full 9 years. But they were also brought in to produce the propaganda. this kind of, massively advertised humanitarian organization with, and Cory will agree with me on this, with one of the most impressive PR industry complexes behind them that I think I've ever seen for such an organization. I mean, Cory, you're the expert on the MPIC, but when we looked into kind of the billionaire complex that are promoting and sustaining the image of the white helmets, have you ever seen anything like this?
No. I mean, actually, I guess the current thing I'm working on, the Greta Thunberg spectacle, is pretty incredible. But I mean, that's nothing to do with the with this. Like, it's not helping to stabilize a sovereign country. Not yet. Well, actually, that's not true, because actually it did just do exactly that with Bolivia. So that's not even true. But yeah, I mean, I think what people really need to understand is that the NGOs that claim to represent civil society have been, they're actually used as weapons against society, and they're funded to the tunes of trillions of dollars to protect and expand foreign policy and empire. And NGOs, especially Purpose, which is an arm of Avaz, which incubated the white helmets, and what else was there? There's 4 different anti-Syria campaigns that they developed.
I know that Avaz was involved with providing the public relations for the war in Libya,
right?
And they were effectively tried to do the same thing with Syria.
Right. I mean, they're completely embedded and enmeshed with the ruling classes and empire itself.
Could you just give us again, maybe a elevator speech, thumbnail sketch, Purpose, and who's backing them, or any important figures that gives us some insights into their potential motivation for their interest here?
Sure. Like, Purpose is an arm, and keep in mind, I've been writing for the past year about the Greta Thunberg orchestrated campaign spectacle, so I don't have everything at the tip of my tongue on Avaz, because I haven't been writing deeply about that of late. But basically, Purpose is an arm of Avaz. The same, I believe, 3 the same founders of Avaz are that of Purpose. Their motto is actually, we remake the world. We remake the world. They actually have a video of basically Syria, like, being bombed and being remade. I mean, it's really incredible.
My understanding from what you've written is that behavioral change seems to be a significant...
Yeah, the specialty is behavioral change, and basically remobilizing citizens as consumers. And so you're not even seen as an individual. You're only recognized as a consumer. And I mean, these I think people are starting to understand now that the nonprofit industrial complex is a really dangerous structure that protects, I mean, especially for any environmental movement, social justice movement, it really needs to be torn down. And I think that's why Vanessa's work is so incredibly important. People are starting to see through this. I mean, just yesterday I saw someone posting, and they said and I'm sure it's someone that reads Vanessa's work as well, and they said from the, few years they've been reading Wrong Kind of Green, now they're able to watch a video such as produced by White Helmets or Purpose of As, the Global Green New Deal, and they're able to see it without Vanessa or I or someone else deconstructing it. They're able to deconstruct it themselves. So people are starting to understand the mechanisms and how they play on emotion, and that's what Purpose specializes in. playing on emotion. They work with corporations. They're embedded with institutions like the United Nations, World Economic Forum, World Bank, governments. So Bill Gates, they're very, very much part and parcel of the ruling classes.
I want to bring back, Vanessa, because Cory, you just mentioned Vanessa's very important work, which includes on-the-ground reporting in Syria, all over Syria. Well, not quite all over Syria. She doesn't go into those areas that are rebel-controlled places where, for example, reporters like James Foley went in there and got his head cut off. So I think that's probably understandable.
Yeah, but it's also, that's a really interesting point, because that raises the question: how do media organizations like CNN manage to get into these areas? Clarissa Ward, Arwa Damon, how are they managing to get into these areas and not get their head chopped off, right? You have to make the assumption that these media outlets, these reporters, are working in collaboration with the armed groups, which are dominated by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And, I don't see any differentiation between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. ISIS was born
what you're saying, just to clarify,
yeah.
I mean, you're not just asserting that. You're saying, what other explanation when other reporters go in there, and...
Well, no, I mean, I did an in-depth research into one particular journalist, Martin Chulov, of The Guardian. And I think, he simply exemplifies this statement. And Alex Crawford recently was also in Idlib and was basically being escorted by Al-Qaeda terrorists, known terrorists.
Yeah.
So we have to start raising the questions. These are embedded, while they claim that I am embedded with the Syrian Arab Army, I'd rather be embedded with an army that's defending its country against a terrorist invasion than be embedded with the terrorist groups that are committing the atrocities against the Syrian people. Mm-hmm. That's a very clear statement, and that's verifiable. But Martin Chulov of The Guardian, when I looked through all of his reports, quite extraordinary. He entered East Aleppo from Turkey, so illegally entered Syria. He was embedded in East Aleppo with the armed groups, which were dominated by Nusra Front. He was interviewing a leader of those armed groups while colleagues or journalist colleagues were imprisoned in the Eye and Children Hospital less than 500 meters away from him. And yet that was never reported on by him. The testimony is there from people like Theo Padnos of their treatment at the hands of the same terrorist groups that were effectively offering hospitality to Martin Chulov. So we have to raise the question, why were these journalists able to fraternize with mass murdering terrorists and come and go with impunity, while other journalists didn't have the same luck?
Valid question.
It's a very valid question.
You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcasting from CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and from partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States. You're listening to the Global Research News Hour. My guests are Vanessa Beeley, who's a journalist and a war correspondent who's visiting Winnipeg, or as part of a 7-city tour, and Cory Morningstar, who's a writer, investigative journalist, environmental activist based in London. And so, Vanessa, I wanted to just give you a chance to talk about some of your own reporting, because you've interviewed numerous civilians throughout Syria, and you're getting that firsthand testimony. And including people who have been recently liberated from some of these, rebel-held areas. And they're telling you quite a different story from what people in the West and people who rely on mainstream media and even a lot of independent media are hearing about the situation in Syria. Could you maybe highlight a couple of poignant examples, if I could put it that way, from your...
Well, I think for me probably the most poignant was the testimonies that I received when East Aleppo, 25% of the city of Aleppo, which was besieged for almost 5 years, was liberated in December 2016. And I was basically there going from district to district, as it was liberated, and speaking to civilians literally as they escaped from the incarceration they'd been submitted to for 5 years. While the media for those 5 years had described their attempts to defend the people of East Aleppo, what they hadn't done, of course, was to describe the conditions that these people were living under, imprisoned by the terrorist groups that, as you say, were described as rebels. But the reality was that people were being tortured, they were being detained, they were being executed. Hospitals had been converted into prisons and military centers, into courts of law, where people were tried under extremist Sharia law and were then executed summarily. People were not allowed to leave. They were being held as hostages. They were being held as human shields. They might have family members in West Aleppo. Those family members were not allowed to make contact or to visit their family in East Aleppo, for example. If they tried to leave by the humanitarian corridors during the final days of the conflict, they were being shelled, they were being killed, and prevented from leaving. The array of crimes that were carried out by these terrorist groups against civilians. If children were injured, they were not receiving any medical treatment. Their limbs were being amputated because that was easier for the terrorists to deal with than actually having to treat them in the hospitals. All the hospitals that were claimed to have been destroyed by the Syrian and Russian military campaign to liberate the area were not destroyed. Many of them were still operating as military centers or prisons. Those that were operating as hospitals were only treating the military armed groups. So fundamentally, what all these liberated areas have demonstrated through testimony from civilians, from myself actually visiting, for example, in East Aleppo, the hospitals that were claimed to be destroyed, is the sheer mendacity of the media in the West. They fabricated the narratives. I mean, I remember standing in the streets in East Aleppo as the area was being liberated and hearing the UN put out a report that the Syrian Arab army were raping the women in those streets. This was picked up by all the Western media who were not present in East Aleppo and immediately disseminated as a factual story. I did a report for RT at that time. I was standing in the streets. I said, this is absolute rubbish. The majority of the Syrian Arab army who are liberating this area come from this area. They're not going to put their lives on the line to rescue their own families and then rape them. There is no, we're laughing, but this was one of the most...
There are good reasons to question these claims.
Well, more than good reasons. It didn't happen. I was there.
Yeah.
It did not happen. I saw Syrian Arab army carrying old ladies down the stairs, helping them out with their luggage, putting them into trucks and making sure that they got to the medical centers, giving exiting civilians tea and food. For some of the children, it was the first food they'd had for months.
What are the civilians that you've been speaking to, what are they saying about the white helmets? What percentage of them, if I could put it that way, are... promoting their work, rescuing people from the rubble?
The Syrian civilians, the majority, apart from the armed groups, the terrorist groups, reject the white helmets. Absolutely 100%. Many of them didn't even know who they were. I remember when I was in East Aleppo and I was saying, do you know the white helmets? They just looked at me puzzled. And then when I said, okay, well, the civil defense, they go, oh yeah, Nusra Front, civil defense. Yeah, we know who they are. Literally, that was it.
Yeah.
And that must raise the question, well, hold on, where are all these white helmet movies being made? Because nobody, including Syrian Arab Red Crescent, had ever seen them actually working with the white helmet on. But I received, I can't tell how many testimonies of them stealing belongings from the bodies of civilians, killing civilians, participating in executions, running organ trafficking operations, child abduction operations, using children in staged events. The list is endless of the accusations levied against the white helmets by the Syrian people. And this claim that all the evidence against them is just Russian disinformation is nonsense. The majority of the evidence against them comes from the white helmets themselves. It comes from their own videos, their selfies with Nusra Front leaders, They're videos of themselves celebrating alongside the terrorist groups. There are videos of them participating in executions or mopping up after executions, dismembering the bodies of prisoners of war, or, of Syrian Arab Army soldiers executing prisoners of war. You know, the list is endless, and this video evidence and this photographic evidence is produced by them, not by Russia or by me.
Yeah, and for that matter, their own social media accounts, which displayed a definite affinity for those groups. It's unfortunate that many of the people who are attacking you based on out-of-context tweets are not examining the tweets of some of these white helmets. But another important point I think we need to mention is that the white helmets and their videos are apparently also being used as effectively as foreign correspondence. You know, that we're just taking these videos, we don't have any corroboration or verification. What airstrike is this connected with? You know, who are these people that are being rescued? We have none of that, and that goes up as part of the news.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is the work of Mike King, an author and historian, who sent me an archive of 4,354 tweets put out by the White Helmets up to October 2019. Now, bearing in mind that the propaganda says, or the marketing says, that the White Helmets are, one, documenting war crimes, and two, they've rescued 115,000 people. He determined from those tweets, and we have to remember the White Helmets use social media extensively as their information feed to the public, as their propaganda feed to the public, to manufacture consent for continued humanitarian, in inverted commas, intervention in Syria. And of those more than 4,000 tweets, Mike King determined that only 3 were recorded with their surname, and only 88 videos. So they only recorded, I think, 625 incidents of rescuing people. That's a tiny percentage of the 115,000 that's being claimed. And as I mentioned in my talk, you know, the monitoring of the White Helmet activity and their statistics is a closed-loop propaganda circle. You know, they're funded by the British government and all the belligerent hostile states that are waging this war. They produce other NGOs, I mean, and Cory will totally appreciate this system. You know, they've created other NGOs as kind of intermediaries. Then they rely on those implementing partners, as they call them, like Mayday Rescue, established by the founder of the White Helmets, to act as an intermediary. They rely upon Mayday Rescue to gather the stats from the White Helmets. So all of these organizations are funded by the governments that have a declared interest in regime change in Syria to provide them with the stats which justifies their presence in Syria. You know, I mean, it's so insidious.
Indeed, and I mean, you mentioned the Mayday Rescue and James Mesurier. Of course, there's a big story about how this founder of the White Helmets died under mysterious circumstances, and so there's been a lot of strange corporate behavior around that, media behavior around that. You know, is it a suicide or was it somebody? Whatever the issue was there, but. There were concerns about you know, the money that was coming in potentially being embezzled, and then maybe that was a motive for this, because there's a tremendous amount of money that was going into this initially, and now you're seeing with developments in Syria, you know, and I believe you mentioned in an article that you wrote recently and in your talk that the Netherlands had come to question where is this money going. So I wonder if you want to sort of break down some of your thoughts about the death of Mesurier and what that means for the in the context of the White Helmets and this complex of this war billionaire network.
Yeah, I mean, what was extraordinary was when the death of Mesurier kind of broke on social media in particular, was the flurry of reaction from various media individuals on Twitter. I mean, Mark Urban from the BBC put out a series of tweets in which he effectively said that the criticism of the White Helmets and James Mesurier was a prelude to murder. That was his his actual description of this. So clearly pointing the fingers at, people like myself, even like Cory, like anybody that has criticized the White Helmets, particularly, of course, Russia. And then he deleted those tweets, and he put out a slightly watered-down version of what he said. I was contacted by PBS to ask for a comment for an interview, and the question was basically, do I feel responsible in any way for the death of James Le Mesurier because of my very public criticism of him? So,
my concealed accusation.
I mean, my answer was, well, there's no official autopsy yet, so how on earth can you even determine who might be responsible for his death? I mean, what if he was killed by somebody? Am I responsible for that? And actually, that, as far as I'm aware, that program's actually not gone out. So I think everyone started reacting, in this kind of protectionist way of James Le Mesurier. But when I spoke to Peter Ford, the former British ambassador in Syria, he told me that he had his suspicions that the UK Foreign Office was actually looking into Mayday rescue. And maybe one of the triggers of that, of course, was the Dutch government report into the lack of transparency in the funneling of funds from the various sponsors to the White Helmets, that it may well have ended up in the hands of the terrorist groups. Surprise, surprise. But what he believed was that it was very possible that James Le Mesurier had started basically creaming funds off the top for himself. And actually, Turkish media reports, interestingly, kind of concurred with that. They said that they believed that he had worries about not being able to pay back, having dipped his hand into the kind of, the fund, the White Helmet Fund, for some time. What is now coming out, again, in Turkish media, and, Western media has gone very quiet on this, and what they appeared to want to do almost immediately is to distance James Le Mesurier from the White Helmets. Suddenly they started to revise history.
One of their top leaders just said, oh, no, he's not the founder.
Exactly, which was just bizarre, because, that's been recorded throughout all of James Le Mesurier's interviews, etc. And, of course, what we found suddenly was some of these media interviews were starting to almost disappear. They were disappearing from the web. His Wikipedia page was being edited furiously by Philip Cross.
As have yours.
Yeah, exactly. So there appeared to be this incredible scramble to cover up, basically, and to distance the White Helmets. So in other words, to kind of protect the White Helmets for any possible corruption of their image. If, for example, I'm guessing, if James Le Mesurier was financially double-dealing or, using the funds for his own purposes, etc. And then in the last few days, the Daily Sabah, which is actually a pro-Erdogan media outlet, has been piecing together the information. They actually got hold of the CCTV footage. What is interesting is Emma Winberg, the wife of James Le Mesurier, has very clear connections herself to the UK Foreign Office. She worked within the Foreign Office for some time as a political officer, which is a euphemistic term for someone that's embedded with the various groups that are used to destabilize countries like Syria. In other words, protecting the armed groups as such. And she also was co-founder of Incostrat with Paul Tilley. Now, Incostrat was funded by the same Conflict, Stability and Security Fund that funded the White Helmets and Mayday Rescue and various other organizations to produce PR for some of the most tyrannical armed groups, including Jaish al-Islam, which occupied Douma. So there's a clear kind of connection with the British Foreign Office with Emma Winberg. Now, Emma Winberg's testimony is now proven to be false. She basically said Mesurier took a sleeping pill at 2:30 a.m., but there is now witness testimony that they were arguing at 3 a.m. Farouk al-Habib, who was a member of both Mayday and White Helmets, visited Mesurier earlier that day. That wasn't recorded in Western media, only in Turkish media. And now the theory that Sabah are putting out is that Mesurier climbed out of the window to escape somebody that had come into the apartment. He got onto the roof and he tried to jump a relatively short distance from the roof to the next roof, we assume to escape, and he fell. He missed the jump. That is what they are now concluding, based on the CCTV footage, based on the evidence that they now have. So it's looking more and more likely that actually it was a bit of a hit on James Mesurier. Quite why, of course, at the same time the Duma chemical weapon attack narrative was failing, it was being shown that Mesurier was responsible for meeting with OPCW leaders in Turkey and producing witnesses to provide evidence for the now proven to be fabricated reports.
Yeah, there were whistleblowers who came forward, and higher ups mentioned basically what it turned out is that they were suppressing evidence that would have changed the conclusions of the report, and that, for example, a canister that had to have been delivered by hand, and other issues. Interestingly enough, there was a reporter with Newsweek, mainstream media, and it was an interesting. That he was threatened. Like they basically he had shown his intention to display this information, and they were saying no, we're not going to publish that, and they were talking about it confidentially. So he ended up resigning from that position.
Tariq Haddad.
Yeah, and he said that, and I quote from his tweet, "I have collected evidence of how they suppressed the story, in addition to evidence from another case where info inconvenient to U.S. government was removed, though it was factually correct," he said. And also, he said, "I was threatened with legal action, from the employers, having inserted that confidentially clause into the contract, apparently for an occasion just like this." And he also stated that he's seeking legal advice from specialists in whistleblowing, and that, quote, "At the very least, I will publish evidence I have without divulging the confidential information." Interesting, coming from a mainstream media reporter, basically, so it's interesting that people who are picking up on this sort of thing, and the way the media is reacting to all of this information. And on the topic of the media, I just want to mention another figure, the legendary American journalist Seymour Hersh. He'd researched and refuted the assumptions that were put forward by people like this Giovanni woman who's... what was that in the...
Janine de Giovanni?
Yes, yeah. She one of your... she's made a minor career out of attacking you and trying to discredit you. And anyway, he's... regarding the August 2013 chemical weapons attacks near Damascus, he put out an investigation called the Red Line and Rat Line, which provided the evidence that it was the gas attack was carried out by opposition groups. This is the guy who broke My Lai, okay, the My Lai massacre. He has a Pulitzer Prize sitting on his mantle, and he can't get this published anywhere in the United States. He had to have it published by the London Review of Books. Okay, so this is one more example of how mainstream media is dropping the ball, and they're using like not only a Giovanni, and I can't quite remember what outlet she was writing from, but another one, Chris York. One of his articles was the...
Not one, there were quite a few.
No, I mean in terms of some of the attacks that you've had to experience, the smears, they've been citing an article that came out around the time you got into Canada, and talking about how, a lot of these usual attacks against it. But the point is that Chris York, I believe he started his discreditation campaign against you around the time that this Emma Winberg became the chief impact officer for Mayday Rescue.
Yeah,
which is an interesting, again, getting back to the timing question.
Well, in fact, all the media smear campaign began after she joined Mayday Rescue.
Was his not like the lead, and then it
he basically led in, and then it was picked up by people like Olivia Solon at Guardian, Oliver Cam, a well-known protector of establishment, NATO intervention, globalism, etc., and various others. I mean, the Syria campaign, which, Cory will recognize, they produced, I think they were the best, they produced a 48-page report in which I was described, I think, as, I don't think I was by then the goddess of propaganda. I think I was a little bit more, lower down the scale. It was Brian Whittaker took it up to goddess.
That was
propaganda.
a Giovanni line, a goddess of Syria.
Well, yeah, no, but she picked that up from Brian Whittaker. Brian Whittaker was the one that created that. Let's give him credit for it.
Sure. We went on plagiarizing.
But I mean, I'd like to just ask Cory here because, with your work on Greta, you've also received a huge amount of backlash from not only social media but also in the media itself. And I wanted to just ask Cory what she thinks is causing this, because very clearly her work is not attacking Greta as a kid, as a person, right? It's attacking those that are exploiting her. And we had the same thing with Bashar al Assad, because we were saying this kid's being exploited to basically promote war, and this is child abuse, in my opinion. But we were attacked for attacking Bana. That's not at all what we were doing. So I just kind of wanted to ask Cory.
Yeah, that was the young child that was calling for no-fly zone.
In Aleppo and calling for, Assad and everyone to be killed and for there to be a World War III.
Who barely speaks any English.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean.
So I just wanted to ask Cory what she thinks is behind this backlash.
I've just been enjoying listening to you converse. Well, the backlash is basically the same as the backlash against Vanessa. But they're trying to discredit my work so people won't read it. I mean, once people read the work, I mean, they're actually, I mean, they're just blown away. So that's the key, to get people to not read it. I mean, that's why they come after Vanessa and try to discredit her. That's the reason for throwing those labels, conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat, all those others that Tim Hayward so articulates and deconstructs, everything behind that. They just basically don't want people to read Vanessa's work, because once they read it, they begin to understand, they begin to see through, the manipulation, the media manipulation, the nonprofit industrial complex manipulation. People start to see through it. And then they'll begin to follow the work of journalists like Vanessa, journalists like myself, like others. And so it's really, really important for them to keep that up. But, it doesn't work. People... A lot of it, like the attacks on my work by Monbiot, the Guardian, which is, an arm of Empire, all that's done is put people towards my work, read the work, and then they follow the work, and they're like, just what's going on? It's Vanessa's. It's, like Vanessa's work, my work's meticulous. It's detailed. It's overly detailed. I mean, it has to be, or people wouldn't even believe it. We're writing about stuff that other people will not write about. No one funds this type of work. We're not. We don't have millions of dollars of foundation funding. This is not the type of work, that anyone's going to get behind.
I feel it kind of important. I just want to point out at this point that a lot of the hit pieces that have been going out against Vanessa and Ava and yourself, Cory, just to follow up on that. I mean, it's I find it kind of remarkable how little they actually address the things that you're saying, the facts that you put on Slay. It's all guilt by association and things like a cleverly cropped picture of Vanessa with Bashar al Assad, and ignoring the context. I mean, that's not an accident.
They never address what's been written.
No.
They never come back and say, this isn't true, this isn't factual. It's just, basically, like I said, the labels, right? The framing. I mean, that's what NGOs do. That's how they're effective. They work on emotion. They work on conformity, peer pressure. They work on framing, on language. And it's very, very effective. And Vanessa's work helps, unveil that. My work, the same. That it helps unveil that. We need more people writing about this. I mean, Vanessa is such a role model for anyone who is interested in journalism, who wants to work towards a better world, who wants to work against imperialism. Forget about going to school. An apprentice under Vanessa, follow her lead, follow her work. I mean, we need more people doing this. There's only so much one person can write about. I mean, the amount of work that Vanessa's done is mind-blowing. I mean, I'm like...
Well, I just...
So much.
I've really been...
my voice, so much gratitude. I mean...
No, but I mean, the same goes out to you, Cory, and to, I mean, journalists like Whitney Webb at Mint Press News, who's also doing...
she's amazing.
And it's exhausting work.
Yeah, it is.
And it's, you know, you just feel like the weight of the world is on you, and it literally, you know, to have that empathy, it just literally can suck the life right out of you. So it takes like a lot of strength, you know, and you have to be able to, you know, like wear a shield, you know, against all the people coming after you, you know, people that are funded and paid to protect and further the interests of foreign policy empire. Like it's, you know, not easy.
I hate to kind of cut folks short because we are running to the end of our time, but I wanted to put in one last question because when I spoke to Ken Stone of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, he seemed to be expressing some optimism that the narrative was breaking down, and he pointed out that the attempts to manufacture consent around the Syria war, they're not working, so they have to resort to these sorts of tactics of trying to deplatform Vanessa and Ava Bartlett and other types of folks who are trying to speak truth to power. And I wanted to get a sense from both of you what kind of optimism you have that this rather cruel agenda that of basically these very wealthy elites using regime change in conjunction with sort of a greenwashing of environmental action. Will they prevail, or will the truth free the people? Because it could be kind of discouraging for a lot of on the ground organizers and independent journalists. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think I have a huge advantage because I spend a lot of time inside Syria. And I guess that my optimism comes from the fact that while there is still, I believe, like huge apathy in the West towards, the criminality of their own governments. I mean, in the UK, we've just voted in. I'm just too depressed to even talk about that, really. But when you're in Syria and you see the resilience and the resourcefulness of the people that have gone through a 9-year war, and it's still ongoing, but they've reclaimed 85% of their territory. They're rebuilding, they're restoring, they're returning to life pretty much as normal as they can get it. I mean, this year, Christmas will be celebrated in the Syrian Christian towns on the border with Idlib that were liberated earlier this year, for the first time without mortars, the threat of mortars, etc. So the optimism for me comes from the revivalism inside Syria, for example, and also I think the shift in the global power balance towards the non-aligned nations. We're seeing a very powerful alliance coming out of this, and I think this is one of the most optimistic parts of this conflict. One, history will be written by the victor for the first time, a victor that has resisted the overarching power of imperialism. It didn't turn into Libya. No.
Yeah.
And then you have this sort of shift in global power towards Russia, China, towards the East, basically. And the U.S. is it kind of can't do anything about it. And so I do believe we're kind of seeing the end of the U.S. empire right now. Okay, it might still take a few years for it to morph into something we hope a little bit more constructive, and we're certainly going to see, we're going to see a lot more action before then, because like any cornered animal, it's going to fight.
Well, Cory, Vanessa, I'm afraid we're at the end of our time, but I really want to thank you both for coming on the show. It's been a great privilege. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
I've been speaking with Cory Morningstar, investigative journalist, environmental activist, and writer, as well as Vanessa Beeley, the noted independent journalist and war correspondent, and they joined us. Vanessa joined us here in our CKW studio. Cory joined us from London. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can hear our program every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. You can also download our program from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, please email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. I'm series host, creator, and producer Michael Welch. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.